Um, so yeah, thanks. I'm kind of excited to be doing this. It's been a while, I guess, since I've had the chance to do something similar because I was out of academia for a bit and kind of only just getting back into it. So I think this is going to be a little bit maybe biographical in a sense. Talking about some of the kind of foundational experiences that I had that kind of have led me to the topic I'm pursuing now in my PhD. So I'd like to start off with this quote, and this is one that I think has kind of really been kind of bouncing around in my head a lot lately. But this comes from a book called Sound Health by Stephen Halpern and Savary. So they say, sound awareness is especially important for although we can easily close our mouths and our eyes to what we don't want to take in, we can't really close our ears. Nature did not give us earlids. Our ears remain open and working even while we sleep. The fact is that we humans are ingesting and digesting sound in one form or another 24 hours a day. Right. So no matter where we find ourselves, whether we're in a hospital room or on a city street or in a concert hall or wherever, sound is something that exerts kind of an enormous influence on our lives, both consciously and unconsciously. And those sounds that we're taking in can have both kind of positive and negative impacts on our experiences of the places and spaces that we're moving through on a regular basis. So one of the questions that I've kind of been asking myself a lot lately is, why is it that we kind of continue to subject ourselves to sound that may be hurting us, and in some cases, kind of even going as far as the kind of romanticize certain urban soundscapes. Right. So this is kind of a question that's a question I've been asking kind of myself a lot lately. But kind of before we get there, so my current kind of research project and interests are about, really about like urban sound design, urban soundscapes, how, and how we hear in different spaces. So I think before I kind of get into that, I'd kind of like to go back a little bit and talk about maybe, a little bit of kind of my upbringing and some of the, those experiences that I think were kind of really important in shaping kind of where I'm at now in terms of my research. Because I think a different trajectory, and I probably wouldn't be doing the same thing, which probably a lot of people say anyway. So in this, I'd like to talk about, how I got to where I was, kind of some of the places that I'd lived and done a little bit of research in some ways. So Stony Plain, Italy, Belgrade, and kind of other places. I'll talk a little bit about kind of the stuff I was doing in my master's research and kind of some of the stuff that went into my master's thesis on blues and myth making and kind of the stories that are kind of circulating in the Edmonton blues scene. And then kind of lastly, I'd like to, I guess, kind of jump from there into a discussion of what it is that I'm doing now. So, using sound and research creation as a method for anthropology, for getting people to talk about, how they hear the environment around them, and kind of how they hear their communities. And then I have this idea that I've kind of been formulating called acoustepathy, which we'll get into kind of at the end. So who am I? I like to just think of myself as a kid from the country, but, and I guess it kind of feeds into this idea of, why it is that I am here today talking to all of you. So, I grew up on an acreage outside of Stony Plain. Kind of at the time I was growing up, there wasn't, there weren't a lot of other houses around us. And I think for me, that setting was kind of where I was really forced to kind of develop my sense of curiosity about the world. we only had, a couple of TV channels when I was growing up. We got internet and a computer pretty late. I think I was like maybe like 15 when we got a computer, like a good kind of computer that we could do schoolwork on. So, a lot of our time was spent kind of outdoors exploring, or, whether it was, outdoors kind of running around fields or whatever you do in the country, and or playing sports, or in books, right? So those are kind of some of the key, I guess, foundational experiences from my childhood. But I also grew up surrounded by music. So I was pretty lucky that I got to know my one of my great grandmas, who she played piano in her church, and at family gatherings until she was like 90. So it wasn't for the last few years of her life that she kind of stopped. And I also my mom also in the picture here, she she played piano, and she ran the choir at the school she taught at, and helped with the band out there. I had a grandpa who he played the saxophone in some old folks bands, and we'd get to go kind of touring around with him to some of their gigs. And the music maybe wasn't the stuff I was listening to now, and or then, it was a lot of polkas and foxtrots and that kind of thing. But I think it was still, a really important experience. So all of that kind of trickled down to me from sort of a young age. And, I grew up learning how to play the guitar and piano, and, eventually other instruments. So, whether I was actively kind of pursuing it or not, music and sort of by extension sound was always something that was kind of present in the background, at least, right? So, eventually I finished high school and I applied to the U of A, and, I'd taken actually a lot of sports medicine classes in high school. And so, and during high school, I'd worked as a trainer for some of the teams that I wasn't playing on. So I started at the U of A in kinesiology, with kind of the idea that I maybe want to become a physiotherapist one day. But, it was something that I wasn't totally sure about, which is probably maybe not always the best point to start from. But yeah, maybe needless to say, that first year did not go well. So the first grade on my transcript is actually an F in calculus. Whole other story. But, after 2 years of kind of in that, I kind of found myself in a bit of an identity crisis. And, I'd kind of gone into kinesiology because I wanted to stay connected to sports. But, then once, I was playing kind of other sports in sort of adult rec leagues and that kind of thing afterwards, I found myself kind of disconnected from that program in a way, right? And so then I guess kind of as I was kind of thinking through what it was that I really wanted to be doing, I'd also, growing up, had been kind of a little bit obsessed with mythology and history from around the world. And, it was kind of when I found myself kind of really drawn towards working towards a degree in archaeology, in particular classical, kind of Roman archaeology mostly. So I switched programs into Anthro and classics, because obviously Anthro was, the place where, in kind of the North American tradition, where archaeology kind of more broadly is housed. And again, I did kind of enjoy that for a long while, but eventually, after a couple more years, I had the chance to go to the U of A's school in Cortona, Italy. So this is a satellite campus that was in a program that was started by a couple of archaeologists from the U of A, that brought over kind of groups of students from the U of A a term at a time. And it was a really cool experience. I got to visit a lot of the sites that we were kind of talking about in class. And it kind of, allowed me to kind of explore those spaces in a way that kind of most tourists don't really get to. So after that experience of kind of going to school there, I went back the following summer to actually work on a field school. So we were on a field site in southern Italy, near Apido Lucano, the town, kind of working on preserving a site that had been excavated kind of earlier. It was the kind of foundations of an estate that Vedius Pollio, who was kind of once the richest man in Rome, had a place out there, and then over time it was kind of reused by different people kind of occupying the area. Eventually it had some like farmhouses built on top of it, and then in the Second World War, all that stuff had kind of been bulldozed and covered over to serve as like a landing strip for Allied planes. So it was a cool site, and that we got to see kind of a lot of kind of different histories kind of in the soil, right? But again, it kind of, as Kevin mentioned in my bio, it was, while I was over in these places, I think what I was kind of most interested in were the stories and the people that that I was living with and living around, and so I think that was kind of where I really kind of got my first kind of feelings that maybe moving towards kind of cultural anthro was the way for me to go, right? And so again, because anthro programs in kind of North America at the U of A, we had to take courses in kind of all 4 subdisciplines, right? And again, it was those cultural anthro courses that I kind of found myself most drawn to, and kind of in a way that satisfied kind of all of my curiosities, right? Because I mean, really, anthro is anywhere that humans have been or have had an impact, you can kind of use the anthropological method, right? So I guess, as part of that, I was kind of really fortunate that as I was kind of switching or fine tuning my interests, there was a new study abroad opportunity that was being offered at the U of A. I guess I forgot to go through the slides, but this was kind of the view from our place that we were living in Cortona, and this was the site that we were working at. I guess I should make notes in my slides to click the button, but in any case, so this was in the summer of 2015. One of the professors at the U of A, Marko Živković, was starting along with Lisa Feder, another anthropologist, starting a field school in Belgrade, Serbia. So this was a program that was really oriented towards bridging art and ethnography, or some I guess embodied practices from the arts with sort of ethnography. So from the course description for the field school, it was meant to hone our ethnographic sensibilities through sensorium training methods, developed in visual arts, performance, music, and mindfulness. And because we were being kind of removed from a familiar environment, we were expected to kind of break our perceptual habits and develop kind of acute receptivity to the nuances of the ways people kind of move and interact, use things and spaces, organize their time, mix smells and tastes, sit in a bus, call a cab. So we were, again, this is from the course description of that one, but we were, I guess, training ourselves to become a sensitive instrument for kind of registering surprises, and noting patterns that, we could kind of ultimately in a very sort of basic way kind of use to, kind of transpose those experiences into, writing or film or photography or sound or performance, right? So so this was kind of the place that I was really first introduced to the idea of sensory ethnography, and something that's kind of become a little bit more of the kind of the main focus of what I'm doing now. Because most of the students on the program, myself included, we weren't fluent in Serbian. The point of the program was to get us to hone in on those senses of place and spaces and objects and body techniques and kind of use our sensory kind of experiences as a way to kind of get into ethnography. So kind of, casting aside kind of the things that we could take for granted and just really focusing on kind of nonverbal cues. So at the end of this project, we created something that we could share at, a final exhibition. So we were kind of lucky that in the space that we were kind of having our classes, it was also sort of an exhibition space, and we were able to set up in there for a bit and invite people to kind of come and see how we were, hearing and seeing and smelling and tasting, Belgrade as people from kind of outside. So, that first year for me was really all about sound, sound experiences. And so my project in Belgrade, for that kind of exhibition, I used found sound and to create sort of a soundscape composition that kind of highlighted, a lot of the sounds that I was kind of experiencing while I was coming and going from classes to the place that I was staying, the family I was staying with. So let me just play that now, and hopefully. Hopefully you're going to be able to hear this, but sorry, I was just seeing the. Oops. Sorry, I was just seeing the chat come up there, but yeah, it was just, these are all just sound. There's this one's not a video. But was it not? Could everybody hear that kind of okay? Or I have one that I'll play later that I think will be, I guess, more important, but sounded okay. Cool. Just heard the last part. Okay. Hopefully for the next bit, we will, last part only two. Okay, that's, okay. Well, hopefully we'll be able to hear this kind of towards the end, and I'll share the slides. So you'll have, I'll share these slides with Kevin to share with all of you. So you'll have those kind of afterwards. But anyway, so, this is just one of the pictures that I took that was from, from the street that kind of went to the space in Belgrade that we had our classes. So we were kind of really close to the Danube, in a space called Savamala, which is kind of, or was, at the time, kind of one of the art spaces where there were a lot of, kind of a lot of venues that were having shows of kind of all kinds. Some of that has changed a little bit in the time since. But so the next year I went back as, part of the teaching staff, and so I had the chance to kind of both work, and research and create in Belgrade again. And so I kind of started experimenting a little bit more with sort of like an intersensory kind of research creation work. So I have a video that kind of also plays with sound as well. So yeah, and in this video that I kind of put together last year, I was kind of trying to play with sounds and kind of, I guess, when sounds kind of maybe don't match up with what we're seeing, or or with the spaces that we're in. Again, these are kind of like really early works. So but hopefully this will play.
What's the part of the promotional video?
This is really a kind of thing that is used for gift giving. If their neighbors don't have rakia, they will give them rakia. So this is in fact a part of the gift exchange.
See you later.
So was that okay? Sorry, I just tried switching halfway through the sound settings. Was that better in the second half for everybody? Yeah, cool. Okay, sweet, good. I've got it figured out. Awesome. Okay. You know, so this, you know, I guess the name Belgrade 433 kind of draws from, I don't know if anybody's familiar with John Cage, but he was a composer, did like sound work, and he had this composition or this idea that he called, you know, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where, you know, it was this idea that you would walk into a room and, or, you know, it could be in a concert hall or something like that. It'd be 4 minutes and 33 seconds of just listening to the sounds in that space. So that was kind of what I was kind of, I guess, not necessarily doing, you know, directly, because, you know, obviously I edited some sounds and that kind of thing, but I guess kind of drawing from that sort of tradition. So in any case, I, you know, in the Belgrade school, I kind of found a space that I felt, you know, really connected to in terms of doing anthropology and doing ethnography, and a space that I, you know, I felt I could really contribute to in maybe a more kind of meaningful way. You know, and at, you know, at the first year and then into the second year in Belgrade, you know, we had this experience where, next slide, there we go. You know, so where one night, a few of us were kind of interested in kind of looking into sound and researching sound. And, you know, one night we just decided that we were going to kind of all meet downtown, and we would just follow our ears around town. So, you know, we sort of there heard, you know, during the summer, there were kind of a lot of kind of open air music venues, or different shows kind of being, happening in and outside. And so we were just kind of following from kind of show to show for a night, and finally kind of at the the very kind of last place that we went to was called Bashta. It was an open air venue, and we could hear for like blocks and blocks, just like really good blues music. So we showed up, we were able to get kind of the very last table in the space, and we sat for hours listening to this group play. And so kind of after the show, we were able to kind of sit and talk with the band, and a couple of us, were musicians ourselves. And so we kind of asked them where the best blues bar in Belgrade was. And so they told us about this place, Vox, where, you show up, it's kind of in the middle of a residential street, and we kind of walked up and down the road looking for it, but there's just this red door, that super small, really small sign, but you kind of push through it, and it's kind of this like really amazing kind of closed off kind of blues oasis in a way. And walk in, it's a venue that's just set up in an old kind of small house. So where the living room would be was kind of where the stage was. The dining room was where some seating was. And kind of there was like a kitchen space that had been kind of cleared out to make a bar. So it was this really kind of tight, close-knit, really intimate space. And we ended up going there, just about every week or a few times a week, every time I was in Belgrade, and kind of developed some kind of cool relationships with some of the musicians there in that way. And so, this was really the push for me when I started my master's to kind of, because I focused on Edmonton and the Edmonton blues scene. It was kind of the push for me to really, think about what kind of hidden spaces and places kind of existed in Edmonton. So, when I came back from Belgrade the second time, I started my master's at the U of A, and kind of started with my master's project, kind of bringing together a lot of the interests that I'd kind of mentioned before. So, music, the senses, sensory ethnography, storytelling, mythology, right? So I kind of sought to, understand how the Edmonton blues scene worked, paying kind of attention to, and kind of to reference Gertz, the stories that people in the Edmonton blues scene were telling themselves about themselves, right? So as a genre, blues is one it's been kind of substantially infused with mythologies, that are shared not just, with people within kind of the blues scene, but kind of outside as well, with a wider sort of popular audience. So there's stories of legendary venues and important figures and cities. And these stories can really offer a lot of insight into how a musical community views itself, right? So when you're talking about places like the Mississippi Delta or cities like Chicago, they've got long established traditions and storytelling traditions regarding the blues to kind of play off of and connect themselves to. But in places like Edmonton and Belgrade as well, there's they don't exist at sort of the crossroads of blues history, or they haven't been mythologized in popular culture to the same extent. So I was really trying to think about how and look at how blues as a genre was kind of, and as a scene was kind of legitimized in those places, right? So when we think about myth, we probably think most of us kind of right away about maybe classical mythology or myths from other places. They tend to be stories that we maybe take to be not necessarily true, or maybe they embellish events, right? So in in the Webster's dictionary, we've got these three kind of definitions that kind of exist in kind of the popular domain, right? So a myth might be a story, a traditional story of ostensibly historical events that kind of serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice or a belief or a natural phenomenon. You could also think of myth as, a popular belief or tradition that's grown up around something or around someone. So for example, someone embodying the ideals and institutions of a society or a segment of society. And a third option, might be, a person or thing having only an imaginary or an unverifiable existence. But kind of as we talk about the blues here, this will be kind of good to keep in mind and refer to. But I think the key for a lot of these definitions, and there's others that exist, but that myth is something that's symbolic to a large extent, that kind of unites a group of people around something, right? And so in sort of popular music studies, De Curtis has kind of written that the music industry itself kind of views myth simply as something to be marketed, meaning the idea of myth has kind of been drained of its significance, becoming almost inseparable from celeb-addled notions of charisma or a toss-away word like legend, right? So it's something that's used kind of broadly to kind of, I guess, orient people to something in sort of a quick and easy way, right? So, in the blues world, this isn't any different. We can see maybe a good example of this in someone like Robert Johnson, right? So, for someone like Robert Johnson, there's Patricia Schroeder in a book about him has kind of said that there were three kind of main components to his myth, right? So there was his rapid musical development, so he kind of had, left the place he'd grown up as someone who wasn't that good at music generally, and had come back as sort of a guitar virtuoso. And part of this was also kind of emphasized in the way that he played. So he would often kind of face away from the audience, playing into the corner, which is actually like into the corner of a room, which is actually something that has been kind of understood as, it's called corner loading, right? And when you play into those corner spaces, it kind of reduces the treble and the bass, or the highs and the lows, and kind of brings out the mid-range sounds in an acoustic guitar or other kind of acoustic instruments, right? And he also was, in this way, he was hiding his hands, so people couldn't really see the way that he was playing, right? There's also the idea of Robert Johnson, selling his soul to the devil at the crossroads to kind of become good at playing the guitar, right? Which is kind of self-explanatory. This is one that we kind of have seen in, it comes up in the Coen brothers film, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" And then there were also circumstances surrounding Robert Johnson's death. So, whether he was poisoned by a jealous husband of a lover, or whether he died of syphilis, or so on, right? So what's important here is that, for Schroeder, is that there's a lot of sort of ambiguities in the story, right? And so for Robert Johnson, the most consistent characteristic of his story was inconsistency. And so, this is, to an extent, also kind of becomes present in how other people kind of think of myth, and how kind of stories around a place, circulate and kind of gain importance, right? It allows, the ambiguity kind of allows people to connect to these stories in sort of their own way, right? But then you also have someone like, B.B. King. So, famously, the guitar that he played was called Lucille. And sort of he named his guitar Lucille because, while he was playing in a nightclub, one night, it was heated by a kerosene barrel. that got knocked over when a fight broke out between two guys. And the venue went up in flames. And Lucille was, allegedly the name of the woman they were kind of fighting over in this story. Or kind of maybe a little bit more recently, you have someone like Stevie Ray Vaughan, who, really his aggressive kind of style of guitar playing was really emphasized, right? And so there's a story of him playing at MTV Unplugged, and he'd borrowed a 12-string guitar from a friend of his, and he was, playing so hard that he actually kind of ended up like cracking the neck of the guitar. But anyway, moving along, these kind of examples aren't necessarily restricted to blues figures, but they can also kind of be used in reference to places as well. So, a really good book about blues tourism is by this guy named Stephen King, not the Stephen King who wrote It or any of those other books, but a different one. But he talks specifically how a lot of communities themselves have kind of latched specifically onto the figure of Robert Johnson. Again, using those ambiguities to kind of connect their own towns to his kind of life story. Right. And so in the book, Stephen King, for example, talks about the city of Cleveland, Mississippi, right? They claimed that an intersection in their boundaries was kind of the intersection where Robert Johnson made his, famous deal with the devil, despite the fact that the same two roads intersect a number of times kind of to the north of that city, right? And then in kind of regards to Chicago, a book by David Grazian, who's, I think, a sociologist, but he was looking at authenticity in terms of the blues scene in Chicago, right? And so he'd kind of divided the city into 3 entertainment zones. You had the Loop, which was a downtown space where, a lot of tourists were at. Lincoln Park neighborhood, which was kind of in North Chicago, a little bit further from downtown, and then Grand Boulevard, which was in the South, which was a predominantly kind of Black community. And so Grazian talks about how authenticity is perceived by various participants in the Chicago blues scene. So he kind of compares and contrasts how audiences and participants kind of experienced these different environments, right? So, depending on whether you were a musician yourself or whether you were a tourist, how you viewed these different venues and these different spaces was kind of really influenced, or it influenced, how you viewed these spaces and how you saw them as authentic, right? So, for people coming to Chicago from elsewhere, as tourists, Buddy Guy's Blues Legend Bar was a place that they saw as really authentic, right? Whereas, maybe if you were kind of a little bit more familiar with blues, you'd have, this place called Blues in the North, was again kind of seen as maybe a little bit more authentic than Buddy Guy's Bar, because it's kind of a little bit, nestled a little bit more in the community, less kind of polished. And then finally the Checkerboard Lounge. This was a venue that was in the South, that actually, I think the Rolling Stones actually played at with Muddy Waters once upon a time, but it was a largely working class, majority Black neighborhood, right? And so how in this book, Grazian is looking at that, how there's, or he defines this as sort of like a sliding scale of authenticity. So depending on how much you know about a music scene, or, you could apply this to other things as well. But depending on how familiar you are with some of these stories influences, how authentic you perceive a space to be, right? Which again kind of fits into these narratives of kind of like myths and ideas of place and that kind of thing. Right. So, the tourist venues in the downtown, they seem, fresh and dynamic to tourists who are relatively new to this to the space. They're, you know, pretty static to locals because they, you know, cycle the same bands through every night, and there's not, you know, a lot of new stuff being done, you know. And when you go to blues, you know, tourists might see that even as more authentic because of its appearance, and you know, even then, you know, for the locals, they might see blues as you know, a space that's a little bit less authentic because it's kind of lost its community as kind of you know, tourists or others kind of have, you know, descend on the place to kind of get what they kind of perceive as an authentic blues experience in Chicago, right? And these sort of authenticities kind of vary in a lot of ways, right? So, you know, we see sort of how people think about authenticity. There's a sliding scale. It's also subjective, right? So depending on your kind of knowledge background, you know, there's also sort of an aspect of, you know, aesthetic or kind of visual authenticity, where, you know, the look of the space itself kind of feeds into how authentic people kind of from outside of the scene view it. You know, and then in some ways there's this idea of sort of, you know, musical fetishism, which you know, which Theodore Adorno in one of his books in the culture industry kind of talks about the fetish character in music, where, you know, because people are kind of told that a space is authentic, they kind of, or, you know, that a certain, you know, person playing a certain kind of music is authentic, you know, they have these images in their mind of what authenticity looks like. And so, you know, regardless of the skill of a player or person, it's, you know, as much up to these kind of these value judgments of authenticity. You know, so I guess what all this means is that in spaces like the Delta in Chicago, you know, you have a lot more musicians kind of working and playing. You have access to a consistent audience, you know, between tourists and locals. And they kind of move, you know, locals are kind of moving through bars and clubs to hear different people play, and tourists as well, right? Whereas Edmonton and Belgrade, you know, as sites that are kind of outside of those established scenes or established storytelling traditions, you know, they don't have the same opportunity, the same audience, right? You know, they're both kind of geographically and sort of you know, culturally disconnected from a lot of these sites. You know, so in Belgrade, you know, you have kind of filling in the gap or this distance, you have, you know, important figures. So when we were there, Dragan Markovic, you know, in DeLuna Blues Band, that was the band that we'd seen that first night in that story I was talking about. You know, you have him as sort of someone who's training a lot of musicians in the community, you know, and brings a lot of younger people into his band to play with them and kind of apprentices in a way. You know, you have someone like Ana Popovic who grew up, you know, going to Vox, that blues bar in Belgrade, and has, you know, since become kind of really well respected in kind of the larger global kind of blues community, right? And then you have a space like Vox Blues Club, which is a site that, you know, a lot of people orient themselves towards, you know, and has played a role in bringing some, you know, other blues musicians, touring ones into Belgrade. You know, and then in Edmonton, you know, this was, and this list is kind of from the time that I was writing. So this is like 2016, kind of pre-pandemic, but right, you had Blues on White, which was a venue that had been around since 1912. You know, it had eventually turned into Blues on White in 1984. You know, but since 84, it had, you know, live music 7 nights a week. You know, and was kind of connected to this larger kind of Western Canada blues circuit, where a lot of musicians would kind of tour through, play a few nights, usually sometimes like Monday to Saturday or something like that, and have a day to travel. And so this kind of allowed a lot of musicians to kind of make a living on that circuit. And eventually, you know, after a while, you know, Blues on White was kind of the only place that was playing live blues music 7 nights a week. whereas a lot of those other bars that existed in that circuit kind of had faded out, right? So that was something that fed into, how the blues community was seeing itself as something really important in Edmonton, right? You also had the Edmonton Blues Festival, which before the pandemic, I think had just celebrated its like 21st anniversary. So it was a long established festival. You have something like CKUA, a radio station that's, while it plays a range of genres, it does have, programs specific for the blues. So with like Cam Hayden's Friday Nights Blues Jam and Holger Peterson's Natural Blues, and then you have someone like Holger Peterson who has, Natural Blues as the longest running radio program in the country. And he also has a Saturday program on CBC. And he started Sony Plain Records, which had a lot of bigger blues musicians on its label, right? So you have these places that serve to kind of authenticate and legitimize the blues in Edmonton, right? So these venues, these spaces, these people are, kind of gatekeepers in a way, in the city, and they allow kind of the Edmonton blues scene and blues community to tie themselves to other places and kind of legitimize their presence, right? There's this idea of something that I kind of formulated in my master's was this idea of like imagined kinships, right? Where, a lot of, again, because Edmonton was geographically distant from a lot of places, it meant that to get a lot of these kind of established blues musicians to come here, they couldn't afford to bring the whole band. So it meant that a lot of local musicians would get the chance, young people would get the chance to play with these figures in their bands while they were in Edmonton, and some of them eventually kind of got to tour more extensively with them, right? So all of these kind of things fed into strengthening and kind of I guess building the blues community in Edmonton, right? And so I guess the thing that I kind of came to the conclusion of in my thesis itself was that myth becomes in terms of like the music scene in Edmonton, it was sort of a unifying practice, right? So not like in a universalizing way, but within the Edmonton blues scene, there was a certain mythical framework that kind of developed and became socially relevant, and whether in some ways it was sort of like self-mythologizing, self-perpetuating, it gained kind of cultural relevance, right? These stories helped really build up Edmonton as a site for blues, right? And so I guess this kind of brings me to what I'm doing now. So I'll just try and finish up quick. So returning to the quote, again, sound is something that we can't really get away from, like, even because sound is also vibrations, even people with hearing deficiencies are also impacted by sound in some ways, right? And so there have been here we are. A lot of research has kind of been done into the relationships, between sound and health, right? Looking at, the ways that sound, in particular, elevated traffic noise exposure has been kind of linked with certain conditions such as like hypertension or stroke or elevated blood pressure, and traffic noise range, average ranges over 60 decibels have been linked to kind of a doubled risk of hypertension. And there's also been, a lot of research into the impact of hospital noise on patients, and the role of sound in recovery, whether that's like music therapy or just in terms of hospital equipment sound design, right? there's also been, at the same time, there's been a lot of studies into sort of the pace of life in different places. So, Robert Levine and Noren Zion this was kind of one of the ones that was really big and well received, and a lot of people have kind of built on it. But they did a study of 31 different cities around the world, and they were looking at the pace of life, and they had kind of 5 main hypotheses. Economic vitality of a space would be linked to pace of life. So places that were kind of more linked to kind of global trade networks would have a faster pace of life. They hypothesized that hotter places would have a slower pace of life than colder places. They hypothesized that cultures and spaces and places that had a higher emphasis on individuality would, be faster paced. Larger cities would be faster paced. And then, those cities that were faster would also have higher rates of mortality, in particular related to kind of hypertension and that kind of thing. But what these studies themselves have also kind of left out is loudness. And, as I'd kind of lived in some different places, for me, a thing that I was seeing a lot of was that, how loud a space is kind of impacts how quickly you want to move through it, right? So there's probably a reason that, cities in sort of around the Mediterranean are have also been linked to kind of longer lives, just because, they weren't built for, traffic or for a lot of the things that kind of the contemporary world has kind of really focused on and kind of developed. I guess also there's been, in terms of soundscape research, this was kind of a term that was popularized by R. Murray Schafer, who was a researcher that was based out of Simon Fraser University, actually. But he popularized the term soundscape in the 70s, and also came up with this idea of schizophonia, which kind of refers to how we're able to hear things that aren't sort of in our immediate physical presence, right? So we can hear music from other places, recordings, that kind of thing, right? And then Stephen Feld, an anthropologist, kind of built on that itself, with this term called Schismogenesis, right? So it's again how these sounds are taken away from their kind of context, and then how we kind of recontextualize them when we hear them recorded, right? So there's obviously been a ton of work done in relation to sound and sound studies, and even right now, there's sort of increasingly kind of experimental and experiential work being done, and kind of this is the kind of intellectual background that I'm kind of hoping to add to, right? So my field work for my PhD is going to kind of focus mostly in Edmonton, as a smaller urban center, because it has, first of all, it's a place that's not kind of often studied, but it also, has a distinct musical environment, kind of has these contradictory political affiliations. It's in Alberta, there's kind of strange relationships to kind of arts and culture, and urban planning in Edmonton is kind of unique, right? So as I've been kind of working on this, I've been kind of building this idea with my supervisor, David Howes, of acoustepathy. So it's kind of borrowing from Stephen Feld's idea of acoustemology. He's an anthropologist, but which is sort of a knowing with and through sound. So, I think that urban soundscapes themselves could, and their betterment could be studied through this idea of acoustepathy, which is sort of a combination of acoustic and empathy, and I kind of use this to refer to sort of the inseparability of sound and feelings of place. And I think by incorporating this idea of empathy into sound studies and anthropologies of sound, we can not only begin to kind of better understand how urban sound environments make people feel, but how we can kind of create better feeling sound environments as well. And the way that I'm planning to do this is kind of initially maybe using, soundscape recordings to kind of as an entry point into talking to people in Edmonton about sound, right? So I plan to kind of work with musicians to kind of use urban soundscape recordings, place kind of music over top of it, or some kind of composition over top of it, and use that as a way to kind of get people to talk about sounds in their communities. So I'll kind of finish. I have just one last thing that I'll play, and then you know, maybe we can take a few minutes to kind of talk about what you think I was trying to do with it, if you think it works, that kind of thing. But here we go. I'll maybe finish that there because we're kind of running out of time. But yeah, I guess any questions? I hope at least part of that was coherent.